The autumn leaves crunched beneath Detective Maria Valdez's boots as she approached the small ranch house on the outskirts of Austin, Texas. 16 years had passed since she first walked this same path, back when she was just a rookie officer responding to a frantic 911 call about a missing 8-year-old girl. Now, with grey streaking her dark hair and lines etched around her eyes from too many sleepless nights, she carried a manila folder that might finally close the case that had haunted her entire career. Ava Robinson had vanished on October 12, 2009, from her bedroom window sometime between midnight and 6 a.m. No signs of forced entry, no ransom demands, no witnesses, just an empty bed and a screen that had been carefully cut from the inside. The case had consumed the Austin Police Department for months, then years, becoming one of those cold cases that families never forgot, but investigators gradually set aside as newer tragedies demanded attention. If you're following this story and want to hear more mysteries like this one, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light, and we love connecting with viewers from around the world. The Robinson family had never been the same after that October night. Tom Robinson, a mechanic at a local auto shop, had aged decades in the span of months, his once steady hands developing a permanent tremor that forced him into early retirement. His wife Linda, a substitute teacher known for her warm smile and endless patience with difficult students, had become a shadow of herself, spending hours each day calling hospitals, shelters, and police departments across the country, chasing leads that never materialized. Their marriage hadn't survived the strain. By 2012, they were divorced, though neither had truly moved on. Tom remained in the same house where Ava had disappeared, unable to bring himself to change anything in her bedroom. He'd preserved it exactly as it was that morning when they'd discovered she was gone. Her purple unicorn comforter still twisted from sleep, her homework for 3rd grade still scattered across her small desk, her favorite stuffed elephant, Mr. Peanuts, still sitting on her pillow where she'd left him. Linda had moved to a small apartment across town, but she visited the house every Tuesday and Thursday, sitting in Ava's room for exactly 1 hour, reading aloud from the same series of books they'd been working through together. She'd started with Charlotte's Web, Ava's favorite, and had continued chronologically through dozens of children's novels, as if maintaining their reading routine might somehow call her daughter home. The investigation had initially focused on the usual suspects: registered sex offenders in the area, recently released criminals, anyone with a history of violence against children. Every lead had been thoroughly investigated and dismissed. The FBI had been called in after the first 48 hours, bringing their expertise in child abduction cases and their sophisticated databases of similar crimes. They'd found no matches, no patterns that connected Ava's disappearance to any known predators or criminal organizations. What made the case particularly puzzling was Ava herself. She wasn't the type of child who would willingly go with a stranger. Her parents had been diligent about teaching her personal safety, and her teachers consistently described her as cautious, even shy around adults she didn't know well. She had no history of sleepwalking or attempting to run away. The cut screen suggested someone had either coaxed her to cut it herself or had done it from inside the room, but forensic analysis revealed no fingerprints other than those belonging to family members. The neighborhood canvass had yielded frustratingly little information. The Robinsons lived on Meadowbrook Drive, a quiet residential street where most families had lived for years and knew each other well. It was the kind of place where children rode bikes until dark and parents felt safe leaving doors unlocked. Several neighbors reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles in the days leading up to Ava's disappearance, but descriptions were vague and contradictory. A white van, a dark sedan, a pickup truck with out-of-state plates. None of the vehicles could be definitively identified or tracked down. Detective Valdez had interviewed hundreds of people in those first crucial weeks. She'd spoken with every child in Ava's third-grade class at Sunset Elementary, every teacher and staff member, every parent who'd volunteered for school activities. She'd reviewed hours of security footage from nearby businesses, looking for anything unusual in the days before the disappearance. She'd coordinated massive search parties that combed through Zilker Park, the areas around Town Lake, and the dense woods that bordered the neighborhood. The media attention had been intense but ultimately unhelpful. Ava's photograph, a school picture showing her gap-toothed smile and bright brown eyes, had appeared on news broadcasts across Texas and beyond. Tips had poured in from across the country, each one dutifully investigated despite the resource strain on the department. People claimed to have seen her in shopping malls in Houston, at rest stops along Interstate 35, in small towns hundreds of miles away. Every sighting was followed up, every lead pursued, but none led to Ava. As months turned to years, the active investigation had gradually scaled back. Detective Valdez continued to review the file regularly, following up on new tips and re-interviewing witnesses when fresh perspectives might yield different information. She'd consulted with psychologists, brought in new forensic experts as technology advanced, and maintained contact with national databases that tracked missing children. But the trail had gone completely cold, leaving behind only questions and the devastating certainty that somewhere a little girl had simply vanished. The breakthrough had come, ironically, not through any investigative technique or forensic advance, but through the confession of a dying woman in a hospice facility in San Antonio. Margaret Holt, a 73-year-old former social worker, had requested to speak with law enforcement in her final weeks, claiming she had information about a child who had gone missing years earlier in Austin. When Detective Valdez received the call 3 days ago, she'd initially been skeptical. Deathbed confessions were often unreliable, the products of guilt, medication, or mental deterioration. But Margaret's story had been remarkably detailed and internally consistent. She'd worked for a private adoption agency that operated in legal gray areas, facilitating adoptions for clients who were willing to pay premium fees for healthy children with minimal bureaucratic delays. The agency, she claimed, had occasionally acquired children through means that weren't entirely legal, though she insisted she'd never knowingly participated in kidnapping. Her role had been to provide temporary care for children while paperwork was processed and new identities established. According to Margaret's account, Ava had been brought to the facility in October 2009 by a man she knew only as Rick, who claimed the child's parents had agreed to a private adoption but wanted no contact with the adoptive family. The story hadn't seemed unusual at the time. Many birth parents preferred complete anonymity in adoption proceedings. Ava had been scared and confused, asking repeatedly for her mommy and daddy. But Margaret had been told this was normal for children struggling to adjust to major life changes. The agency had placed Ava with a family in Oregon who had been on their waiting list for over 2 years. The Kellys, David and Patricia, were a wealthy couple in their 40s who had struggled with infertility and were desperate for a child. They'd been told that Ava's birth parents were young and unable to care for her, and that the adoption needed to be processed quickly to avoid complications. They'd paid nearly $50,000 in fees and had been advised to move to a different city to help their new daughter adjust to her new life without reminders of her past. Margaret's conscience had troubled her over the years, especially as she'd seen news reports about missing children and wondered if any of them might have passed through her care. When she'd been diagnosed with terminal cancer 6 months ago, she'd decided to come forward with what she knew. She'd provided Detective Valdez with detailed records she'd kept hidden for over a decade, including photographs of Ava during her time at the facility, documentation of the payment received from the Kelly family, and contact information that might still be current. The information had taken 3 days to verify, but everything checked out. The adoption agency, had been shut down in 2011 following an investigation into fraudulent practices, though none of the staff had been charged with kidnapping. David and Patricia Kelly had indeed moved from Oregon to Washington State in late 2009, and property records showed they'd purchased a home in Spokane, around the time Margaret claimed they'd received Ava. Most remarkably, school enrollment records showed that a girl named Emma Kelly had started fourth grade in Spokane in January 2010. Her birth date listed on the enrollment forms was October 15, 2001, just 3 days different from Ava Robinson's actual birthday. The photograph in the school records, though taken months after Ava's disappearance and showing a child who appeared subdued and withdrawn, was unmistakably the same girl whose missing person poster had hung in Detective Valdez's office for 16 years. Now, as Detective Valdez approached the Robinson house with news that would forever change the lives of everyone involved, she found herself struggling with emotions she'd thought she'd learned to control. In 16 years of police work, she delivered news of deaths, arrests, and solved cases, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. Ava Robinson was alive. She was 24 years old, married, and working as a pediatric nurse in Seattle. She had no memory of her life before the age of 8, having been told by her adoptive parents that she'd suffered trauma that caused memory loss. The complexity of the situation was staggering. The Kelly family, while technically guilty of purchasing a kidnapped child, appeared to have genuinely believed they were participating in a legal adoption. They'd raised Ava, whom they'd renamed Emma, with love and care, providing her with excellent education, medical care, and opportunities that had allowed her to thrive. She'd excelled in school, played varsity soccer, graduated from nursing school, and was by all accounts a happy, well-adjusted young woman. But Tom and Linda Robinson had lost 16 years with their daughter. They'd missed her first day of high school, her graduation, her wedding. They'd endured decades of not knowing whether she was alive or dead, safe or suffering. The knowledge that she'd been living a full life while they'd been consumed by grief was both a blessing and a fresh source of anguish. The investigation into how Ava had been taken from her bedroom that October night was still ongoing. Margaret had provided enough information to identify Rick as Richard Castellanos, a man who had worked as a contractor for the adoption agency and specialized in acquiring children for clients who couldn't or wouldn't wait for traditional adoption processes. He disappeared after the agency had been shut down, but law enforcement agencies across the country were now actively searching for him. The method of Ava's abduction remained somewhat unclear, but Margaret's records suggested that Castellanos had used a combination of manipulation and mild sedatives to coax children from their homes. He'd apparently spent weeks observing potential targets, learning their routines and identifying vulnerabilities. In Ava's case, he'd likely gained entry to the house through an unlocked door or window, then convinced the sleepy child to come with him by claiming there was an emergency involving her parents. The cut screen had been intended to make the disappearance look like an external abduction, deflecting suspicion from anyone who might have had inside knowledge of the family's routines. It was a clever misdirection that had successfully focused the initial investigation on stranger abduction scenarios, rather than the more complex reality of organized child trafficking. Detective Valdez paused at the front door, knowing that the next few minutes would irrevocably alter the Robinson family's understanding of their own history. She'd already spoken with social workers, psychologists, and legal experts about the best way to handle the reunion between parents and their adult daughter who had no memory of them. The process would be delicate, potentially traumatic for everyone involved, and would require careful professional guidance. The doorbell echoed through the house, and she heard Tom Robinson's familiar footsteps approaching. Over the years, she'd delivered many updates on the case, false leads, dead ends, and disappointing news. This time, for the first time in 16 years, she carried hope instead of heartbreak. The door opened, revealing Tom's weathered face and questioning eyes. Behind him, Linda had appeared, as she always did when Detective Valdez visited. They'd been expecting her. She'd called ahead to arrange the meeting, but they couldn't possibly anticipate what she was about to tell them. "Tom, Linda," Detective Valdez said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "I need you both to sit down. I have news about Ava, and it's going to change everything." The living room fell silent, except for the ticking of an old mantel clock that had marked time through 16 years of waiting. Linda's hand found Tom's, their fingers interlocking in a gesture that spoke of shared grief and enduring connection despite their divorce. They'd maintained their Tuesday and Thursday routine even after their marriage ended, united in their vigil for a daughter who might never come home. "She's alive," Detective Valdez said simply, and watched as the words hit them with the force of revelation. Linda's sharp intake of breath, Tom's stunned silence, the way their hands tightened around each other, these were moments that made every frustrating dead end and sleepless night worthwhile. The explanation took nearly an hour. Detective Valdez walked them through Margaret's confession, the investigation that had followed, and the current status of their daughter, who had grown up believing she was someone else entirely. She explained the legal complexities they would face, the psychological challenges ahead, and the careful process that would be required to potentially rebuild relationships that had been severed by crime and circumstance. Tom and Linda listened with the intensity of people hearing their own salvation, asking questions, seeking clarification, trying to comprehend a reality that was both better and more complicated than anything they'd imagined during their 16-year vigil. Their daughter was alive, healthy, successful, and happy, but she was also a stranger who had built a life without them and had no conscious memory of the love that had surrounded her first 8 years. The photograph Detective Valdez showed them, a recent picture obtained through social media, revealed a young woman who bore clear resemblance to both parents but had grown into her own person. She had Tom's strong jaw and Linda's expressive eyes, but her smile was different, shaped by experiences and relationships they'd never been part of. She looked confident, joyful, surrounded by friends and a husband who clearly adored her. "What happens now?" Linda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Detective Valdez had prepared for this question, consulting with experts who specialized in reunification cases involving long-term separation. The process would be gradual, mediated by professionals, and entirely dependent on Emma's, willingness to explore her origins. She'd been contacted by authorities in Seattle and told about the investigation, but she'd requested time to process the information before making any decisions about contact with her biological family. The psychological impact of learning that everything she'd believed about her identity was based on a lie couldn't be underestimated. She'd need counseling, support, and time to reconcile her current life with the revelation of her past. Her adoptive parents, while legally vulnerable due to their unknowing participation in child trafficking, were also struggling with the knowledge that their beloved daughter had been stolen from another family. "The FBI is handling the broader investigation now," Detective Valdez explained. "They're looking into other cases that might be connected to the same trafficking network. Margaret's information suggests that Ava wasn't the only child acquired through these methods, and there might be other families who never got answers about their missing children." The implications were staggering. If the adoption agency had been operating for years before being shut down, and if they'd processed multiple illegal adoptions annually, there could be dozens of children who'd been separated from their families and given new identities. Each case would require individual investigation, careful handling, and sensitivity to the complex relationships that had developed over years of separation. For Tom and Linda Robinson, the immediate focus was on preparing themselves for a potential reunion with a daughter who had become a stranger. They'd need to understand that she wasn't the 8-year-old who had disappeared from her bedroom, but a fully formed adult with her own life, relationships, and identity. The process of rebuilding any kind of relationship would require patience, professional guidance, and acceptance that the outcome might not match their dreams of reunion. The first step would be a carefully orchestrated phone call, facilitated by counselors on both ends, allowing Emma to hear her biological parents' voices and begin processing the reality of her situation. If she chose to pursue further contact, meetings could be arranged in neutral settings with professional support. The goal wasn't to undo 16 years of life experience, but to potentially add new relationships and understanding to her existing world. Detective Valdez left the Robinson house that afternoon, knowing that her role in the case was far from over. While the immediate mystery of Ava's disappearance had been solved, the broader investigation into the trafficking network would continue for months or possibly years. Richard Castellanos remained at large, and there were likely other victims whose families deserved answers. The case had also revealed systemic issues in private adoption oversight that would need to be addressed through policy changes and increased regulation. The agency that had processed Ava's illegal adoption had operated for years without sufficient scrutiny, facilitating transactions that tore families apart while enriching themselves through exploitation of desperate parents and vulnerable children. 3 weeks later, the first phone call between Ava and her biological parents took place under the supervision of trained counselors in both Seattle and Austin. The conversation lasted only 20 minutes, but it represented the first direct contact between them in over 16 years. Ava's voice was cautious but kind as she listened to Tom and Linda explain their years of searching and hoping for her return. She told them about her life, her career as a pediatric nurse, her husband Marcus, who worked in software development, their small apartment near Pike Place Market, where they liked to spend Saturday mornings browsing the vendors. She spoke about her adoptive parents, David and Patricia Kelly, who had been devastated to learn the truth about her origins, but remained supportive as she navigated this unprecedented situation. The conversation was stilted, formal, heavy, with the weight of lost time and uncertain futures, but it was also a beginning, a tentative bridge across 16 years of separation. Both sides agreed to continue regular phone contact while Ava processed the revelations and decided whether she wanted to pursue in-person meetings. Linda had prepared a photo album covering the 16 years since Ava's disappearance. Holidays celebrated in her absence, birthdays marked with cake and candles for someone who wasn't there, graduations and achievements they'd imagined she might accomplish. She'd also preserved every newspaper clipping about the case, every flyer distributed during searches, every small memorial they'd created to keep her memory alive. Tom had written letters, hundreds of them over the years, addressed to the daughter he hoped would someday read them. They chronicled everything from mundane daily events to major life changes, from his struggles with depression and divorce to his gradual acceptance that she might never be found. He'd kept them in a wooden box in Ava's preserved bedroom, never sure why he continued writing, but unable to stop. The gradual process of reconnection unfolded over months, with weekly phone calls giving way to video chats, then eventual plans for a carefully orchestrated meeting in neutral territory. Ava chose Portland, Oregon, roughly halfway between Seattle and Austin, as the location for their first in-person reunion since she was 8 years old. The meeting took place in a hotel conference room, with counselors present to help navigate the emotional complexity of the situation. Ava arrived nervous but determined, accompanied by her husband Marcus, who had become her strongest source of support through the ordeal. Tom and Linda brought photo albums, letters, and a small jewelry box that had belonged to Ava's grandmother, items they'd saved for the day they'd hoped would eventually come. The physical resemblance was unmistakable, but transformed by time and experience. Ava had grown into a poised, confident woman whose bearing reflected the love and stability provided by her adoptive family, but her features clearly echoed the parents who had grieved her loss for 16 years. The meeting was emotional, but carefully controlled, focused on sharing information and beginning to understand each other as adults, rather than attempting to recapture a relationship that had been severed in childhood. Over the following year, relationships gradually developed between Ava and her biological family. She began using both names, Emma with her adoptive family and established friends, Ava when communicating with her birth parents and exploring her original identity. She learned about relatives she'd never known existed, discovered family traditions she'd missed, and slowly began to understand the profound impact her disappearance had had on everyone who'd known her as a child. The legal resolution of the case proved complex and emotionally challenging for everyone involved. Richard Castellanos was eventually located in Mexico, where he'd been living under an assumed identity while continuing to facilitate illegal adoptions for wealthy clients. His extradition and prosecution provided some measure of justice, but it couldn't undo the years of separation and trauma experienced by multiple families. The Kelly family faced their own legal jeopardy, though prosecutors ultimately chose not to pursue charges against them, given the clear evidence that they'd believed they were participating in a legal adoption. Their relationship with Ava remained strong, though they struggled with guilt over their unknowing role in perpetuating a crime against another family. The broader investigation revealed that Castellanos had been responsible for at least 12 other child abductions over a 15-year period, operating across multiple states and selling children to couples who were willing to pay premium fees to avoid traditional adoption waiting periods. Several other families received long-awaited answers about missing children, though not all the stories had happy endings. For the Robinson family, the resolution brought both closure and new challenges. Their marriage, which had been destroyed by grief and the stress of endless uncertainty, remained ended, but they'd found a new kind of friendship based on shared love for their recovered daughter. Tom had finally been able to pack away Ava's childhood belongings, not because he was letting go of her memory, but because she was alive and creating new memories as an adult. Linda had returned to full-time teaching, finding purpose in nurturing other people's children while maintaining her relationship with her own daughter through regular phone calls and visits. She'd become an advocate for missing children's families, working with law enforcement to improve investigation protocols and support systems for parents dealing with similar tragedies. The case had fundamentally changed Detective Valdez's approach to cold cases, reinforcing her belief that persistence and new perspectives could yield breakthroughs even after years of apparent dead ends. She'd been promoted to head the cold case unit, where she applied lessons learned from the Robinson investigation to other long-unsolved disappearances. 2 years after their first reunion, Ava made the decision to legally reclaim her original name while keeping Emma as a middle name, symbolically bridging the two parts of her identity. She'd developed meaningful relationships with both sets of parents, though the bonds looked different from traditional family connections. With her biological parents, she shared genetics, early childhood memories that occasionally surfaced, and a mutual commitment to building new relationships based on their current selves rather than trying to recreate the past. Her adoptive parents remained the people who had shaped her personality, values, and worldview during her formative years. They'd provided the love, stability, and opportunities that had allowed her to become the person she was, and no revelation about her origins could diminish the reality of those relationships. The wedding invitation arrived on a spring morning in 2027, beautifully designed and carrying both names, Emma Ava Robinson Kelly requests your presence. She was remarrying Marcus in a ceremony that would include both sets of parents, symbolizing her integration of all the relationships that had shaped her life. Tom and Linda sat together in the front row of the small outdoor ceremony in Seattle, watching their daughter promise her life to a man who had supported her through the most challenging period of her adult life. Across the aisle, David and Patricia Kelly dabbed at tears as they watched the child they'd raised exchange vows with someone who understood both parts of her complicated identity. The reception featured photo displays that chronicled two separate childhoods: Ava's first 8 years with the Robinson family and Emma's remaining childhood and adolescence with the Kellys. Rather than competing narratives, they represented complementary chapters in a single life story that had been interrupted by crime, but had ultimately led to a fuller understanding of identity, family, and resilience. Detective Valdez attended the wedding as an honored guest, representing not just law enforcement, but the persistence that had made the reunion possible. Her speech at the reception focused on the power of never giving up hope, even when logic suggested that hope was futile. She credited the breakthrough not to superior investigative techniques, but to Margaret Holt's decision to speak the truth in her final weeks of life. The Robinson case became a landmark in missing persons investigations, leading to policy changes in adoption oversight, improved coordination between agencies investigating child trafficking, and new protocols for handling long-term missing persons cases. It demonstrated the importance of maintaining active files, even when leads dried up, and reinforced the value of treating each missing person as someone's beloved family member rather than just another statistic. For the families involved, the resolution provided a complex kind of healing that didn't erase the pain of separation, but transformed it into gratitude for unexpected reunion. They'd learned that families could be broken by crime and circumstance, but they could also be rebuilt in new forms that honored both loss and recovery. The little girl who had vanished from her bedroom in Austin in 2009 had become a woman who carried the love of multiple families, the strength that came from surviving unimaginable circumstances, and the wisdom to understand that identity could be both stolen and reclaimed. Her story served as a reminder that even in the darkest mysteries, truth could eventually surface, and that the bonds between parents and children could survive even the most devastating interruptions. 16 years after Ava Robinson disappeared, her case was finally closed, but her story continued, written now in her own words, shaped by her own choices, and enriched by relationships that had been lost, found, and transformed by the long journey toward truth and reconciliation.